So good afternoon, at least when you're here on the East Coast. Perhaps for some of you, good evening, I see already, and others, good morning. It's a great pleasure to welcome you uh, in this seminar in the series of the Department of Epidemiology of the Harvard Chance School. My name is Bert Hoffman. I'm the chair of epidemiology, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome today's seminar speaker, Rishi Desai. Dr. Desai is an associate professor of medicine in Harvard Medical School and in the Harvard School of Public Health. He is an epidemiologist in the division of pharmacoepidemiology and pharmacoeconomics at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, focusing, as you will see, most likely from his seminar, focusing on methodological aspects of pharmacoepidemiology, particularly inference from non-randomized studies on effects of medications. Dr. Desai, Rishi, it's wonderful to have you, and it's my great pleasure to give you the floor.
Well, thank you, Bert, first of all, for having me on as a speaker. This is a great series, as I was mentioning, and I'm really glad to be contributing to it. So thank you also for that introduction. I will try to share my screen and let me know when you see it, and we should get going. Okay, great. So over the next 35 to 40 minutes, what I'll try to do is I'll try to summarize a series of activities that we have been entrusted with by the FDA to improve kind of the data infrastructure as well as the methodological capabilities of its Sentinel system. And if you've never heard of Sentinel, I have a brief introduction of what Sentinel is to kind of set the stage, and then I'll try and spend most of my time on the second and the third topic, where we describe the data infrastructure along with an actual demonstration project that we use on that data infrastructure, and then conclude with some remarks on the future of all this regulatory activities. So if you have never heard of Sentinel, Sentinel is actually born out of a law, FDA Amendment Act in 2007, largely following the Vioxx tragedy, where a hugely popular drug called Vioxx was found later to be associated with increased risk of myocardial infarction. And the Congress got, of course, involved because it was a huge public health outcry at the time. And it required the FDA to kind of establish its own system where it can ask questions related to medication safety. Before then, the FDA entirely relied on these voluntary reports that come in from public regarding drug safety, which of course have many limitations, as you might know. So in 2007, FDA was asked to set up a system where it can conduct its own studies, and that's what Sentinel became. So the pilot program was launched 2008 called Mini Sentinel, which was successful, and at the conclusion of that pilot project in 2016, the full-scale system, the Sentinel system, was launched. We were brought on in 2019 as the Innovation Center to kind of oversee the methodological development as well as data infrastructure development activities, which I'm going to be summarizing today. But the overall goal of the Sentinel system is to assess the post-marketing safety of medical products. The nomenclature ARIA will appear a few times, which I will introduce here. So ARIA stands for Active Risk Identification and Analysis, which is kind of the analysis part of Sentinel, and it serves a really important function in the US public health. So every time a serious safety concern comes up is brought up to the FDA from analysis of clinical trial data in phase 3, where some signal might appear, but it is not sufficient to make any precise conclusion on, or analysis of these voluntary adverse event reports, then an observational study is considered. So every time this is done, FDA first has to assess whether its own system, the Sentinel system, is able to address that safety question or not. And if it is, then it does that. So it goes on to do an analysis in the Sentinel system, and only in cases where it is not sufficient, the system is not sufficient, then it can issue post-marketing requirement to the pharmaceutical company, which, as you might imagine, has important implications because these studies are typically conducted prospectively, and takes much resources and time to accumulate the data. So Sentinel system is really the first line of defense when it comes to generating post-marketing surveillance evidence by the FDA. And historically, the data that have been contributing to the Sentinel system have largely come from these national scale insurance programs. And the reason really is that insurance programs like Aetna or Humana that you see on this list, they cover a vast population. And so by law, FDA is required to put up a system that is Sentinel that covers at least 100 million people. And the easiest way to do that is to cover a vast majority of the people through these insurance programs. And so historically, Sentinel has been comprised of the distributed databases, which are coming from large insurance claims program. Now, the slide here shows the impact of the system. So this is a analysis of the Sentinel investigations published in 2023 for the first 5 years of the program, 2016 to 2021, just to show you what kind of impact these studies that are conducted in the Sentinel system has on the public health. And so if you focus on the bottom box here, you clearly see that Sentinel investigations result in informing important regulatory actions like labeling changes, for example. In many cases, it does produce reassuring evidence where FDA looks at the data and says no regulatory action is needed. So overall, I think the system is hugely important in how the FDA kind of regulates the products once they are approved for marketing. The question then is, if the system is working so nicely and is highly impactful, what is the need to continue investment in the data infrastructure and the methods that I'll talk about? And so this is now taking a step back and showing you the total number of questions or safety concerns that the FDA wanted to address, and how many it could or could not address over that 5-year period from the same paper. So the focus here is on the yellow boxes, where it says about 60% of the questions that the FDA had. So out of the 330 safety questions over the 5-year period, about 60% of them in this yellow box, FDA determined that the Sentinel system was insufficient. And so it clearly is able to work well when there are certain elements that the system can offer are met, but then in many other instances, the system was not sufficient. And the FDA recognized that through the analysis like this and others that it had done internally. And the table here shows you the root cause analysis of why the system was insufficient for a large majority of the questions that the FDA was interested in. And this is too small to read, but just focusing on the top half of the table, 4 out of 5 top reasons for insufficiencies can be traced back to measurement challenges that are inherent to administrative nature of insurance claims data that have been used as the backbone of the system. So you have things like need for laboratory data for outcome assessment. For instance, it's just not there in claims data. There is sometimes need for pathology reports or radiology reports to confirm an outcome of interest, which is not there for administrative records. And so the FDA, back in the day, this was 2018, recognized the need to harness alternative sources. And this was then Commissioner Gottlieb describing his vision for a cross-cutting data enterprise for real-world evidence. And so if you look into the fine text of this, it's calling for bringing in data from diverse sources, most noticeably the electronic health records, in addition to claims data, to be able to reduce some of the reliance that was on claims data historically and be able to broaden the reach of the system that is Sentinel. And so right after this, we have been kind of trying to kind of achieve the vision that the commissioner described in his vision, and have a series of publications. So the two publications on the left are outlining how we practically attempted or set out to realize the vision to bring in more diverse data sources in the Sentinel system. And on the right, there are two papers, one describing the resulting infrastructure, which I will talk about, called Real World Evidence Data Enterprise. And then on the bottom, there is this commentary by Schneeweiss et al. Demonstrating or outlining how an improved data infrastructure like that can really add value to drug safety investigations. So these are just some references for your own time, but I will describe the real world evidence data enterprise in the next few slides, just to give you a flavor of what kind of data infrastructure improvement are we talking about here. And so this is a schematic showing the RWED, or the linked EHR claim system, as of today. So it's a two-pronged system, designed as a two-pronged system, when on the left-hand side, you have the commercial arm of the system. On the right-hand side, you have what we call a development arm of the system. So on the development side, what you see is these large, mostly tertiary care medical centers like Duke and Mass General Brigham, where the advantage here is that through institutional affiliations, we have really rich access to granular data like imaging reports and free text notes for patients. But the drawback here is that because these are kind of regional health systems, they don't bring along large volume. So between the four centers that we have, we only have 4.5 million lives, which may not be sufficient for some of the safety questions. And so commercial network is nice in that sense because it does have the volume. So these are commercial EHR providers who have linked their EHR data to claims data, commercial claims. And so we use the commercial network to do the actual analysis. We use the development network for algorithm development and toolkit development. So that's the idea, because on the commercial side of things, we cannot actually have the same level of access. Some of these data items exist behind their firewalls, but they just cannot make that available to us because of patient privacy concerns. So what we do is we develop the phenotyping algorithms, and I'll share an example of this later in the deck. But we develop the phenotyping algorithms, validate them thoroughly across multiple of these systems when possible, and then we take that and apply it to the commercial network to derive some of the variables of interest, and then we use the commercial network to address the queries whenever the FDA is asking questions related to drug safety. So that is, in a nutshell, how we kind of operate the system. The availability of EHR has meaningfully added the breadth of the system in terms of what it can capture. So what this slide is showing you is that historically, the common data model, the Sentinel common data model, was populated with items from insurance claims. So you have reliable information on encounters, dispensing, diagnosis, so on. That's all coming from claims data. But on the EHR side of things, what you also have is a vast majority of the items stored as structured fields like vital signs, lab results, for instance, prescription orders. And so what we do is we also convert some of these structured EHR data, which are structured but maybe processed differently at different sites, in a common form in the common data model through these different tables. There is also other pieces of information that is obviously quite important, like death, for instance, where we bring in vital records from states whenever possible. And then the last piece that we are really proud of, that we made quite a bit of progress, is a lot of information in the EHR is stored as semi-structured, unstructured form, which is historically not available for research for the most part because the processing requires quite a bit of time. So what we have done is, on the development side of things, development network, where we have access to these types of data, we have pre-processed them because the volumes are huge in some cases. For example, in Mass General Brigham, for 20-year period, we have 150 million notes. And so we try to create these metadata tables where we extract information on the factual items from the notes, like who authored the notes, what department it came from, and so on, so we can get to that information pretty quickly when needed without having to process all the large volumes. So that's the metadata table, which is a tabular format, much easy to query versus the clinical notes where the actual information resides. And so once we know where we want to look for information, then we actually go on into the notes and try and extract the information. What we've also piloted is this feature engineering table, which basically is what I'll explain in the next slide. But on a broad level, what it is it's trying to pre-populate some of these important concepts that are of routine use for drug safety investigations, and bring them in the data infrastructure in a common data model as well. And this is useful because you want to use some of these standard data fields across many of the Sentinel queries, and you don't want to wait until the need arises to have that information just for efficiency purposes. So what we are talking about here is things like some important outcomes like anaphylaxis, things that may be of importance to define populations like obesity, for example, things that may be of use routinely as confounding variables like history of suicide attempts, smoking status, for instance, so on. So what we do is we process the free text notes using the identical NLP pipeline, some of which are mentioned here, and we select this based on kind of the need of the concept, and then we apply or process these data across various sites, and then we pre-populate them in a structured way in the common data model for us to use later down the line. So this is just an attempt to make the information that so far has been kind of out of reach for most research purposes more accessible to researchers in Sentinel whenever it's needed. So this is just a high-level summary of what we are trying to do there. And then this is one slide showing some validation results for some of the concepts that we have mined and saved in the common data model. So this is a result showing you for two concepts, obesity and smoking, because some of this information also exists in the structured EHR fields. But what we show here is that on top of what is already existing in the structured fields, if you actually look at their written notes and use natural language processing to extract this information, you can actually meaningfully add more information about these concepts for patients that it remains unseen or not observed when just using the structure information. So relative increase of about 20% for obesity, about 30% for smoking, which is quite meaningful. And the obvious question, of course, is that yes, you do find more information, but how valid is this more information? And so we also try and manually validate whenever possible. And here what you see is that the performance of the NLP extraction is actually quite robust for both smoking and obesity, both positive mentions, so yes, obese, yes, smoker, and negative mentions, meaning not obese and not smokers. So overall, I think our experience has been quite promising, trying to kind of harmonize data extraction across various sites, and we think that moving forward, this can really add value to the Sentinel system by including information that has historically been underrepresented in these types of data sources. So that was my quick overview of the progress that we have made on the data infrastructure side of things. Now, over the next few minutes, what I want to show you is how is this all coming together in kind of addressing the bottom line here, which is the FDA wants to study more questions related to medication safety using this improved infrastructure and some of the methods that I briefly mentioned. So what we did was we, in consultation with the FDA, we set out to use an actual case example where in the past the FDA said the study was not feasible. So IAS system was insufficient to conduct that study in the Sentinel system. So these results are also published recently, and you can take a look at them at your own time. But I'll briefly summarize what we tried to do here. So this is a bunch of snapshots from what we call the ARIA insufficiency memo. So every time the FDA decides that a safety concern is not addressable by Sentinel, it has to put out this memo in public forum on its website to explain why it thinks that the system is not sufficient. So back in 2017, a popular drug class, SGLT2 inhibitors for diabetes, FDA was concerned about increased risk for pancreatitis, acute pancreatitis, related to use of these medications. So the medications are listed here, includes a bunch of different molecules from a bunch of different manufacturers. The memo describes the primary reason why FDA thought that this question was not answerable in claims data. So this is in the red box. So what FDA reviewed the literature back when it was trying to decide this, and found that the outcome of pancreatitis was actually not well identified using administrative records. Some published validation studies suggested a PPV of 70% or less. And for large administrative records like Sentinel, the PPV was not known. They were also concerned that using administrative records alone would lead to underestimation of the case burden, because many outpatient events that do not lead to hospitalization would be undetected. And so the reason for the FDA's inability, or Sentinel System's inability to study this, was related to outcome definition. So the outcome was not well captured in the administrative records. Now, the inclusion or adding elements from EHRs, of course, would lead to addressing some of these concerns. And so soon after publication of that memo, FDA actually commissioned its own validation study for pancreatitis, which is this Floyd paper published 2023, and found that the diagnosis codes had low PPV, or 60%, and outpatient events were not well captured. So what they reasoned in their memo was actually happening in their own validation study. Now, to address that, they also tasked a work group with the task of developing a computable phenotype. So what a computable phenotype is really an attempt to harness information from multiple sources. So in this very practical example, what this means is that in addition to diagnosis codes, which are typically used to define an outcome of interest in drug safety studies, if you can bring information from various parts of the EHR, so in this case, lab results, amylase and lipase results, as well as from imaging reports, mentions of inflammation or pancreatitis, confirmation of those events, or a confirmation of a competing diagnosis, then you can actually probabilistically define which diagnosis codes are likely to have a more probability, a higher probability of being a true case. So once you put together all this information, you basically develop a computable phenotyping model, which allows you to probabilistically define the events. And against manual validation, what this probabilistic approach showed is that fixing the PPV at 90%, which is an acceptable PPV for a drug safety outcome compared to what we had just using the administrative records of 60%, the sensitivity is much higher, about 92%. And this is actually quite promising, because this addresses both of the FDA's concerns. One was imperfect or low PPV, which is much higher in this case, because it includes additional information from other parts of the EHRs. And the reduced sensitivity, because our outpatient events were not captured in codes. But when you look for this type of information in physician notes, you are more likely or able to find it more of these cases. And so both of this was true, and the performance of this algorithm was judged to be quite robust. And so what we did was then we took this algorithm, the probabilistic phenotyping algorithm, and applied it to the commercial network to show that we could actually study the previously infeasible question with this new infrastructure. So what we did was we used the commercial network from the RWEDE, and we compared the risk for acute pancreatitis between SGLT2 inhibitors, which is the drug class of interest, and a reference drug class, which is another antidiabetic, second-line antidiabetic treatment. And what we show is that overall, over the 2 years, the acute pancreatitis incidence was actually pretty low, as is the case for many of these rare safety events, less than 1% by the end of 2 years. And we did not see much going on. So it's a signal that was not confirmed by our data. And these are the hazard ratios, again, for the mean analysis up top, and a bunch of subgroup and sensitivity analysis, and they are pretty consistent, suggesting no increased risk with this drug class SGLT2 inhibitors for the risk of acute pancreatitis. So we were able to deliver or complete this study within 9 to 12 months, which is pretty good time turnaround for a complex safety study like this. And this is all because we had invested upfront in development of these data infrastructure along with the methodological tools that go along with that to be able to use them readily. So this was a successful demonstration project that showed the FDA that the RWED, the new infrastructure that we've developed, was ready for use. And so where do we go from here? So this is just some slides summarizing where we are in the kind of life cycle of the system and process, and where do we go from here? So we have been working hard on kind of defining a harmonized process guide, because if you think about a program like Sentinel, it does dozens of studies every year, and it would be useful to come up with a process that is repeatable across these studies. Of course, there are specific decisions that you have to make depending on the clinical context, but the process, the steps that you follow to get there, we felt like should be repeatable. And so we put out a kind of a process guide to harmonize the inferential studies that we conduct in Sentinel. This was published a couple of years ago now. It's a stepwise process where you go from defining your causal question of interest to thinking about how well you can emulate these concepts in your data set, thinking about fitness for purpose, thinking about the important concepts like protocol registration and what kind of data checks or diagnostics that you can do, still remaining objective without looking at the results, and so on, and eventually go on to do the inferential analysis. So we have adopted this process by and large for all protocol-based inferential assessment in Sentinel. And every time we are confronted with a new question, or FDA has a safety concern of interest that it wants to study using the new infrastructure, we go through this process and design our studies in a principled way, and have transparency along the way by publicly registering the protocol, taking public comments and addressing them prior to the analysis phase to stay objective. So these steps are outlined in great detail in our publication, which is cited here. So I encourage people to look into this if they are interested. And the RWED actually now is in production mode. What this means really is that through the completion of demonstration projects, we have shown and convinced the FDA that the system can be used now to address actual drug safety questions of interest that are being raised for the FDA. So one example is this risk of NAION or non-arteritic anterior ischemic optic neuropathy, which was coming up with the use of GLP-1 receptor agonists, which are hugely popular drug classes, as I'm sure all of you know. And what we are doing with this new system now is to help the FDA design the study looking at this risk of NAION after use of or initiation of GLP-1 receptor agonists. And the EHR data are valuable in this instance because we are augmenting the claims-based investigations with a validation study of how well claims-based codes can capture the incidence of NAION and supporting the FDA with additional clinical data that can be leveraged for potential residual confounding. So things like BMI and HbA1c, which is not available in claims data, can be used if you bring along some EHR data. So the real take home here is that through the substantial investment of time and resources in the first 5 years, the FDA now has a system that it can use whenever it wants to address some of these more complex questions where outcomes are salient and claims data may not be sufficient to address some of these concerns. So I will wrap up by some high-level conclusions. We have made important advances in capabilities of the Sentinel system to use EHR data more meaningfully alongside claims in the Sentinel initiative. The methodological tools that I was briefly mentioning, like the computable phenotyping and NLP to extract information, are also quite mature now that we are using them to actually study drug safety and not as methodological demonstration projects. And of course, the last bullet point is more forward-looking, where there is great hope for more machine learning and AI to be able to streamline some of these process by use of pre-trained models, and hopefully, if they do well, then trying to limit the resources and investment that is needed to develop some of these models for feature extractions from free text data. The EHR data sources are also maturing as we speak. So when we started back in 2020, trying to bring in more EHR sources, there were few options for us to look into, but now I think that has also changed with more and more players coming into this space, and it really has quite an explosion in the availability of some of these newer EHR sources that one can integrate in a national system like Sentinel. So we remain quite hopeful. We feel like we have made quite a bit of progress and tangible progress in terms of using the EHR data to meaningfully advance Sentinel. But I think in the future there remains a lot of work to be done and a lot of hope. So with that, I would like to thank, of course, it takes a village to complete work as complex as this and as meaningful as this. So our collaborators from MGB system, from Vanderbilt, Duke, Kaiser Permanente, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute, as well as the FDA, have played a tremendous role in helping us getting to the stage that I described today. So overall, I think this is my last slide. I'm very happy to take questions or comments, but hopefully this was useful and of interest to some of you.
Dear Dr. Desai, thank you very, very much for this impressive overview on Sentinel and applications. Perhaps if you unshare, we can see each other. And I have a few questions in the chat already. First one is I think it's Wes Ismail. Wes, would you ask your question yourself, or shall I do it for you?
Uh, I can go. Well, thank you, Dr. Desai, for the presentation. So my question was about managing all these data sets and how those data sets are linked, who's responsible for managing linkage, storing these data sets.
Yes, excellent question. So we actually have quite rigorous QA processes. So all the data are managed locally. So just to give you an example, at Mass General Brigham, where I am, we link the EHR data to claims data locally using identifiable information, of course, which is highly sensitive. And after linkage, we run standardized QA programs to characterize the quality of the linkage, to characterize the information that is populated in the common data model. And the goal there really is to be able to identify any irregularities or any kind of suspicious data jumps that you may see, which may be explained by something else or inaccurate extraction of the data. So we have, and all of this, by the way, is publicly posted on the Sentinel's GitHub page, where all our coding and all the QA packages are available. So it's a systematic quality assurance process that we follow.
Thank you. I have a question in a minute from Don Goldman, but if you don't mind, I would like to do a follow-up to this one because I had a similar question. Namely, you say the main challenges that the FDA saw were in measurement area, in lab,
Yeah.
in pathology and radiology. And I saw also the system in which you make basically use of the commercial networks, the Health Verity and TriNetX.
Yeah.
How do you know about the quality of these commercial networks? How good are they, basically?
Yes, so there are a couple of ways to do that. So what we do is we kind of run this benchmarks on a population level on things like how commonly you are able to identify smoking rates, for example, and if there are big differences in those types of sources versus sources that you kind of know well and trust. If there is a big difference, then that raises a flag on kind of some challenges in those sources, which is not what we have seen. The other approach is we try and run validation studies whenever possible through manual review of some of these concepts. But of course, FDA is always more and more always pressed for resources, and so this has not been as frequently as we would like it to be, but we have tried.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I go to Dr. Don Goldman. Don, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So thank you. I was glad to see Richard Platt's name on the slide because I was working pretty closely with him when Sentinel was just a small demonstration project. So it's really great to see this update and how far it's come. I was wondering, we have our favorite countries when it comes to agile Sentinel systems, Israel, Sweden, Denmark. Obviously, they're smaller countries, less complex, and so forth and so on. But what lessons have you learned from them? Do you look to them for kind of ideal state that you're trying to replicate? How are you thinking about that? And uh, also, could you talk a little bit of how you calibrate the sensitivity of the model so that you get enough signals, you're not going to miss much, but on the other hand, you're not inundated with false positives?
Yeah, so great questions both. So the first one, I think we have to admit that getting to a state where we have as complete recording on subjects as a country like Denmark or Israel, it remains a tough goal to meet in the US. And the reason I think reasons are less technological and more kind of a reflection of how the healthcare system is. So one of the big lessons that we have learned, I guess in hindsight, we should have expected that. But even when you are able to bring along these large quantities of EHR data, it really doesn't mean that you have the full picture. What I mean by that is that because the EHR data by nature of the collection come from a specific system or institutions. And whenever patients do not use those systems for some part of their care, you actually don't see them. And so we describe this as the problem of information leakage, which we see quite prominently in some of the EHR sources. And we know that because of the claims linkage. So claims will tell us if a visit happened or not, and EHR will tell us what was recorded in their visit. Now, we see frequently that the visits happen, but we just don't see any corresponding information in the EHR. What this tells us is that the visit happened at a different healthcare facility, which is not feeding the EHR back into the system that we have access to. So that was a major challenge, and we've tried some pilots like using state level information exchanges, which kind of tries and addresses this problem by bringing EHRs from multiple healthcare systems within the same umbrella, but that remains a future goal. So we recognize that by design, countries like Denmark and Israel, which have more stable access and more nationalized type healthcare systems, they have a leg up on us. We have more challenges. And the second question you asked was also very interesting. So the false positive. So the FDA, I should say, only activates the system whenever it has a sufficient reason to suspect that something is beyond a false positive signal. So what I described today is mostly signal refinement or signal evaluation activities. Upstream to that is also a whole suite of methods and tools that they have to do signal identification, which is an activity where you don't go in with a pre-specified hypothesis, but you try to look for signals from mining of large scales of data. And there, I think the approach, the FDA's approach has been to look at each signal that appears through the identification or data mining and try and clinically make sense of what could be plausible. And a subset of these signals then eventually come for signal refinement or evaluation. So that's what we were talking about today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Your question, Don, reminded me of the fact that we very often refer to Denmark not as a country in epidemiology, but as a cohort. And besides that, they have Greenland at least still. So any further questions or comments from the audience?
I mean, if there really are none, I have another question.
Don't go ahead, Don. Yeah, I cannot see any. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just don't want to hog it. But it seems to me that a system like this could be used for more than pharmaceutical sentinel. So, for example, it might show a signal if there were a major increase in the use of beef tallow. What do you think? Is that beyond the beyond, or is that
is spot on? So over the years, what we have seen actually is that various federal agencies have been trying to make clever use of Sentinel to address its own questions of interest. So CDC, for example, leverages the system or the infrastructure, I should say, to try and identify events of its interest that are of more infectious nature. The other interesting use that we have seen is use of the Sentinel system to also kind of provide population level estimates on chronic conditions like diabetes and so on, which of course remains a goal of the CDC too. So overall, I think yes, you are absolutely right. The system is built with a specific goal in mind, but I think the agencies are realizing that the treasure trove of data already exists, which can be leveraged to do multiple other things as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, but that's a great insight.
Thank you. Well, we are limited in time, but we have a question. Juan de la Hoz.
Yes, thank you. Great presentation. I really enjoyed the whole setup that you guys have. I was curious about the differences in the quality and quantity of the data between the hospital data from these like tertiary healthcare systems that you have versus the
Yeah,
commercial data that where you extrapolate things to,
yeah.
or do the transfer of these computable phenotypes. Do you see any differences in population characteristics? For example, amount of care that people get in one system versus another one,
Yeah.
age or income or
Yeah. Absolutely. Great point. So there are some inherent differences in the systems that we bring on. So the large tertiary care systems, they are excellent. They're excellent at kind of capturing some of these more serious end of adverse events, where people are required to kind of be admitted to a hospital or have some intensive procedures. And so we are able to capture some of these things quite well, and characterize the performance characteristics of these adverse events in these tertiary care systems. The other end of that is these relatively healthier populations that we see in some of these commercial insurance systems, where the EHR data are largely coming from primary care practices. And so what we see is that you sometimes do not have the same rates of events, but that is not by anything else, but because of the patient population characteristic differences. There are also systems that are more integrated, so like a mini Denmark, if you will, the Kaisers. So Kaisers have their own EHRs. They are also the insurance provider, and they also have their healthcare clinics and stuff. And so that is more inclusive, more comprehensive coverage of a patient journey versus something like a Duke healthcare system or MGB, where patients show up when they have some really untoward thing happen to get tertiary care, but then they go back to their community and we don't see them for a period of time, which is very different from a Kaiser experience where you basically are able to see the patient across his or her journey. So yes, so many challenges, and that's also actually one of the reasons why we try to be deliberate in bringing in diverse data sources. It, it brings along some challenges, yes, like how transportable are the algorithms, but it also provides us with the diversity that we need when the goal is to kind of reflect the population level experiences of the US.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a question that must be a final one in the chat of Mosen Malingwiat. Mosen asks, building on a previous question, do you foresee that these data systems effectively being integrated with international data sources, considering aspects like data standards, regulatory compliance, and technical infrastructure at any point, or has there been any attempt? Question mark.
Yes, so I will say that there have been attempts. Of course, the integration could mean different things, but what we have done in the past, we as in Sentinel, is lead these consortiums where kind of public health, important public health questions that impact various countries across the globe, and conducted these master protocols, or led these master protocols, which basically allows researchers from these various countries to come together as a consortium and develop a study design, a standard set of variable definitions, and then we all go along, implement those in our own systems, and then aggregate the data to report out to see if the observations that we have are similar or different across various systems. So COVID-19 was an excellent example where COVID-19 outcomes were studied using some of these master protocols across various countries. There are also more salient things like impurities detected in common antihypertensive medications, and master protocols were also utilized then to see how that disrupted medication use across various countries. And so, yeah, so there have been examples where we try to be as collaborative as we can. Of course, each of these regulatory bodies have their own preferences.
Idiosyncrasies.
So it's not always as seamless as you would hope it, but it's complex.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to make a few final comments. First of all, invite you to our next week's seminar, which is both on Zoom, but also in person in Kresge 502. And it is a seminar by Dr. Isa Dahabre, Trial Augmentation Using External Data and Models Toward Harmony Between Observational Studies and Trials. Look very much forward to that. Then I would like to thank Beth Williams again for organizing this all so well, and also for bringing this seminar on YouTube soon. It will be posted there, if I understand. And finally, I thank all those who were on there here, and particularly, of course, our speaker of today, Dr. Rishi Desai. It was a great seminar. Thank you very much, Dr. Desai, and see you next week.
Thanks, Bert, again for the invite.
Thank you.